Super. Great. Everyone see this?
Yep.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So my name is Carlos Rivera Santana, and I'm a assistant professor at the College of William and Mary. But I want to start by acknowledging that I am in the lands of the Powhatan, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, and Potawatomi, and Rappahannock, the first peoples of what today is called Virginia in the United States. My home is Puerto Rico, or its indigenous name, Boriquén. And as a Caribbean and a Latin American, I affirm my Afro-Caribbean Yoruba heritage from my mom's side and my Taino Arawak indigenous heritage from my dad's side. And for First Nations, for Puerto Ricans, and sure, for all global South peoples, it is not lost on us the colonizing and genocidal process that is occurring in Gaza. Of course, there must be a ceasefire. That is a modest ask, if anything, but we must demand a stop at once from all flanks possible, and this is one of the flanks, to this settled colonial genocide project headed by the psychopath Benjamin Netanyahu and his government based in an Italian law and necropolitical logic. So the first sign is made by a Palestinian Arab feminist collective in the US, and the second is a meeting that's happening in Australia on Sunday, the 5th, by Socialist Equality Party. So I just can't talk about colonization, coloniality without talking about this to an extent. So I will, this presentation, it's not exactly kind of centered on my, I guess, experience of teaching aesthetics, as some of the wonderful other presentations that I've seen. It kind of, it's centered by an often overlooked, I find, aspect of aesthetics that is not necessarily a positive or celebratory part of it. I guess I'll in this kind of seminar type talk, I'll just point to something that I see that has been overlooked to an extent, and I'll obviously refer to my pedagogical experience here and there. I don't have a lot of experience. I've only been teaching in higher education or in university for about 10 years. I don't presume to teach about teaching at all. So I'll just mention a few of that, sprinkle a few of my pedagogical experiences. But the center of this talk revolves around the heart of the talk, perhaps, revolves around to asking the question. Well, there's a few questions. One, and perhaps that's not necessarily a question, an assumption that there's a relationship between the formation of race and colonization. I'll talk a little bit about that. And secondly, there is a relationship between aesthetic discourse and the formation of race and racism within colonization. So that's something that I've been working in my research for some time now. And I hope that you'll find this useful, kind of from any course or any perspective of a course that could be about or talking about race and racism and colonization, okay, all the way to talking about aesthetics, but focusing on the overlooked aspects of aesthetics, particularly from a critical perspective, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So I start this talk with Black Skin, White Mask, a quote from Fanon, or two. The last one is on page 112. And the conversation that was just before this quote, or that Fanon alludes to, is that he is the victim, and this is the 50s, he is the victim of a racist slur that I won't repeat, but you are more welcome to read it. It's in page 112 of this book. And he responds in this way in his book, and I will just quote, after receiving that racist slur from a child, I have already stopped being amused. It was not that I was finding febrile coordinates in the world. I existed triply. I occupied space. I moved towards the other, and the evanescent other, hostile, but not opaque, transparent, not there, disappeared. Nausea. An unfamiliar weight burdened me. In the white world, the man of color encounters difficulties in the development of his bodily schema. I was battered down by tom-toms, cannibalism, intellectual deficiency, fetishism, racial effects. I took myself far off from my own presence. What else could it be for me but an amputation, an excision, and hemorrhage that spattered my whole body with black blood? So this kind of phenomenological reflection that Fanon makes on his Black Skin, White Mask really has a heavy, very heavy aesthetic content. And other people have written about the aesthetic elements of Black Skin, White Mask and Fanon's writings in general. I would refer you to Alejandro de Otto, has a great book that discusses this. But effectively, why this matter is, we have often thought about race, racism from a scientific racist perspective, that is from an Enlightenment perspective, that is from a discourse of anthropology perspective, too rationally. But there is also an aesthetic perspective of that creation of race, the birth of race, the race interaction, the phenomenon, the intersubjective interaction, and the very racist act. So I hope this talk would speak to a little bit of that reflection from perhaps a history of aesthetics perspective. It's Fanon. Yes. I am not coming this from a philosophical perspective, as in the discipline of philosophy, nor even the discipline of aesthetics. Strictly speaking, I'm talking here from a cultural studies. I regard it as a critical critical culture studies perspective, and that's Stuart Hall. And his definition of culture studies for me is extraordinary. And it's the non-disciplinary study of culture. And culture, perhaps I should have capitalized that seed, all the things that encompasses culture, not only the ideas of popular culture or high culture and all these categories that are very involved with aesthetics and art. So I will be kind of transiting between different disciplines, and I to be honest, I care very little about sticking to one type of discipline. So one of the courses that I discuss, what I'm going to share with you in terms of the relationship between race, racism, and aesthetics in the context of colonization is Art in Decolonization, a course that I've been teaching for some years now. I taught it first in the City University of New York, and a few campuses there, and now currently teaching it at William and Mary in Virginia. And one way or another, I've been talking about this, the topic of the aesthetic conceptualization of race in other courses I've taught in for instance, in the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia, where I had my PhD and worked a little there as a lecturer. But this is the bulk of my experience with aesthetic teaching. So rather than just discussing aesthetic from a perspective that speaks of aesthetic judgment, obviously a notion elaborated by many philosophers, particularly Kant with his critique of judgment, that aims to determine the extent to which his aesthetic judgment is universal, and tied to pleasure and desire, and how subjective judgments can be at the same time objective. I'm thinking here of aesthetic discourse, particularly Western aesthetic discourse, and how it's inherently contingent, that is historically, socially, and culturally produced, and is shaped by the constitution of the model of beauty and ugliness that is the reference point for aesthetic judgment. Okay, so here I will be more thinking along the lines of aesthetics as a discourse, and how it changes, and how it also shapes intersubjective relationships and other discourses, of course. So this is a little bit of a shameful input of my book and the definition of aesthetic discourse that I discuss in my book. But most importantly, the book cover is by an amazing Indigenous Australian contemporary artist called Danny Mellor. So that's probably the best part of the book, the artwork. So, and I'm very much informed by these two extraordinary books that students really love as well. I find I don't get them to read the whole book, but specific chapters. And it's by Humberto Eco, and it's this kind of examination of the Western history of beauty, and the most interesting part, the Western history of the aesthetic, Western history of ugliness. So really interesting books, and this is a little bit of how I shape my pedagogical approach, particularly my research, in categorizing aesthetic discourse as something to be examined, re-examined, and critiqued, in my case, in the context of the process, the ongoing process, I would say, of colonization. So a few of the aspects of ugliness, and I'll just depart from beauty here. And it will make sense later as it relates to race and racism. But here is like a few paintings of that I referred to in Eco's book, by Caravaggio, the very recreated piece of Saturn devouring his son. This is by Rubens. And Saturn becomes an important figure in this narrative and dominating narrative of ugliness in Western discourse, particularly as it relates to cannibalism. And I'll refer to that a little bit later on. And the Divine Comedy, of course. And here, by then, and this piece is one of the images that was crafted in like sketched in the engravings for the book. And this is interesting, particularly because we'll probably talk about this 15th century period, end of 15th century, beginning of 16th century period, because this is when colonization starts. Colonization happens in 1492. And by then, there is a very large inventory of like representations of ugliness, particularly within the category of monsters. Monsters become a very important focus to this time in the 15th and beginning 16th century. And it's no surprise this kind of duality approach, light and dark approach, where within ugliness, within monstrosity, otherness is classified. Otherness become kind of located in the space of monstrosity within the larger category of ugliness. So, but the important part perhaps is that by then there's a large inventory, a huge classification grid of different kinds of monsters that were either associated with hell and hell's portents, or moralized one way or another, either through evil or other kinds of categories of moralization. But there's a lot to draw from in this time, and we will see that those narratives placed in this space of ugliness, which was the dominating aesthetic discourse in terms of otherness, is where the first peoples of the Americas, when Christopher Columbus is found by indigenous peoples, where they're put strongly, dominantly into this system of classification, this pre-existing system of classification that eventually becomes one of the main components of the emergence of race and the affective triggers in which race and racism will, to this day, I would argue, operate. So what do I mean by ugliness? There's a few definitions of ugliness. Kant has one, Marx has one, There's a whole book by Carl Rosenkranz entitled Aesthetic of Ugliness. But I like Nietzsche's definition. This is in The Twilight of the Idols, and he says, ugliness is seen as a sign and a symptom of a degeneration, ever suggesting of exhaustion, heaviness, senility, fatigue, any sort of lack of freedom like convulsions or paralysis. All this provokes an identical reaction, almost like a projection, but a parallax projection, a parallax being the kind of inverted image in a mirror or any kind of reflection. And all this produces the value judgment ugly. But what does man hate? And I'm using man very intentionally. There's no doubt about this. He hates the twilight of his own type. So there's some kind of like psychoanalytic Freudian projection in this creation, or not creation, or judgment or framework of ugliness that has to do much more by the viewer, by the spectator, than the thing in itself or the person itself. Okay, so when I'm talking about ugliness here, I'm speaking almost nothing about the subject that is called or referred or framed as ugly. This is a portion, a part of the triptych of the Temptations of St. Anthony by Diógenes Ballester. And this is a very interesting painting because this was created in 1505, 1506. And it proposes a very large inventory of monsters and portents in a surrealistic kind of flair, yet very, very telling of the epoch in terms of the wealth of aesthetic representational devices that is kind of available for that category of monstrosity within, obviously, the larger category of ugliness. So monster, and this painting is again Saturn devouring its son, but this time by Goya. And I like, and these are some quotes, one by Foucault and another one by Silvia Federici and Caliban and the Witch Woman, the Body and the Primitive Accumulation. I'll just read it. On the basis of the power of the continuum held by nature, and this is in the order of things, the monster ensures the emergence of difference. The monster is the rootstock of specification, but it is only a subspecies itself in the stubbornly slow stream of history. And this is another quote by Federici. The great multitude of men, wrote Henry Power, an English follower of Descartes, resembles rather Descartes' automata, as they lack any reasoning power, or only a metaphor can be called men. The better sorts agreed that the proletariat appeared as a great beast, a many-headed monsters, wild, vociferous, given to any ritual vocabulary, identified with the masses as purely instinctual beings. So again, monsters and the various categorizations of monsters becomes a space where often from a Western perspective, and particularly from a Western aesthetic discourse perspective, where otherness is kind of placed and located, okay? And otherness, like deployed in its various ways and forms. This could suggest inequality, of course, but it could suggest many other forms of subjection or subalternization. So here, so these are, so I'm talking about, I'll dive in soon into colonization, but important authors to kind of discuss what is the link between colonization and race. Authors from the Coloniality Network would establish that race emerges strongly as a marker of inequality within colonization. And it's ongoing, and it's more sophisticated form that these authors called coloniality. But what's important for us is that, of course, there was inequality before colonization. And of course, there was ways in which race and racism would operate in different times and spaces or periods in history. But it doesn't emerge as strongly into colonization happens in the Americas predominantly. The movement between inequality being mainly determined by an affiliation to a given institution, that is the church, or being Muslim, being from Jewish practice, etc., moves from there to an inequality that's based literally or lodged literally in the way that not only it's created from an idea of phenotypic marker, right? But the aesthetic conceptualization of race, I would argue. So a few of these authors that are extremely important, one of them being my mentor, which is Linda Martin Aikoff. Very useful for this kind of thinking in terms of making the link between colonization and race. Obviously, Aníbal Quijano as well, one of the first persons who made this link in a very strong and important way. And this is Nelson Maldonado Torres. And this is a definition by coloniality that I find really, really useful for my students in order to get them to think about it. And I'll just read it quickly. This is from an article on the coloniality of being, published in Cultural Studies. Coloniality is different from colonialism. Colonialism denotes a political and economic relation in which the sovereignty of a nation or a people rests on the power of another nation, which makes such nation an empire. Coloniality instead refers to the long-standing patterns of power that emerge as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, that's important to us, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations. Thus, coloniality survives colonialism. It is maintained alive in books, in the criteria of academic performance, and cultural patterns, and common sense, in the self-image of peoples, and aspirations of self, and in so many other aspects in a modern experience. In a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. So quickly, I'll just talk about one aspect of the emergence of the aesthetic conceptualization of First Peoples in the beginning of colonization, and how they were conceptualized. The story obviously starts in 1492, okay? And this is a picture of the Caribbean, of course, because it's something that is really important to notice is that from 1492 all the way to 1513, 1512, the focus of colonization is here. It's in the Caribbean. And like the first island that Columbus finds, or it's found, is San Salvador, which was called, it's close to Cat Island in the Bahamas. And its indigenous name is Guanahani. and there are indigenous people with Taino Arawak as well. So it starts here, and this period is often not overlooked because it's not a continental area. We often start we focused on the history of colonization in the continent when the Aztec civilization goes to war pretty much with Hernán Cortés, and also in the south with the Inca people, with the Inca civilization. But the Caribbean becomes a laboratory of colonial endeavor. And what happens there, it's extremely important because one can see how it manifests and all around the Americas. And thinking, just reflecting that this is 1492, 150 years before, or over 150 years before, well, over 110 years before, like the first settlement and settled colonial process in the U.S., and hundreds of years in other countries. So this is pivotal. So the first representations of indigenous peoples largely were represented as a type of monster, as is indicated in this image, in which what featured prominently was the figure of the monstrous indigenous cannibal. One can see that their heads have dog faces, they're chopping a human, and this conceptualization, these engravings were produced mostly in Europe, what today is Germany, Switzerland, Sweden, etc. And they were produced in workshops of people that never visited the Americas. Yet these images were ubiquitous in Europe, and eventually, obviously, would arrive to the Americas. So this is another one, more of a map depicting the indigenous cannibal. This is another map, sort of stating almost like a warning. And this is another representation that featured prominently in many of the engravings and the imagery produced of indigenous peoples in Europe. And we can see at the top, the bearded person, the bearded man, is Saturn, which is the representation in between the end of the 15th and beginning of 16th century, basically of the devil, because of the importance of cannibalism and kind of doing the most horrendous and horrid thing that any creature can do, and from a perspective of this Western aesthetic tradition. Whether it was true or not, I can assure you, based on the research at this point, no culture in the Americas consumed human flesh for its sustenance. Okay, now if you want to ask me about sources, I'm happy to provide them. So this was a representation to cast indigenous peoples, firstly and foremostly, as one of the most horrid, kind of actions undertaken by subhumans and monsters. There's many practical reasons of why this was projected this image was projected onto indigenous peoples. I can list many, but I'm running out of time. But one of them was there is this impulse to enslave indigenous peoples. And in the beginning of 16th century, this end of the 15th century, there was an edict that prohibited to enslave indigenous peoples by the Queen of Spain then, and unless they could not be Christianized. So no one could enslave an indigenous person if they could be Christianized. And cannibalism is an unforgivable sin. So the accusation of cannibalism was deployed largely and widely to many indigenous groups across the Americas, and this became a narrative and a trope all throughout many colonial endeavors, from the Americas all the way to Papua New Guinea, to Australia, to Torres Strait. The accounts are incredibly like very well present. But it began with this kind of impulse to be able to enslave indigenous peoples, and just the accusation of cannibalism was enough to convert an indigenous person into a slave. There is a connection that's Saturn in the middle also between the representation of cannibalism with the monstrosity of indigenous cannibals, and also witchcraft, which is fascinating because the same workshops that were creating the engravings and all these representations of indigenous cannibals were creating the representations of witches of the time in the 15th century, end of 14th, 15th, and 16th century. And they had some of very common tropes that rendered witches as in a kind of very similar monstrosity framework. So, and when we go later on, and this is a piece in 1599 that it's incredibly rare, entitled Los Tres Mulatos de Esmeralda. It's currently in Madrid, but it was painted in Ecuador by an indigenous person in 1599. It's probably one of the first signed paintings made in the European style, and it's certainly one of the first paintings in European style by an indigenous person. And this kind of aesthetic trope eventually becomes narrativized and converted into pigmentation, that is the representation of Blackness. So I can talk a little bit between cannibalism and the depiction of indigeneity from in the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century, how it leads into this narrativization that can be represented literally in color. But at this point, just keep in mind this extraordinary piece that I was just looking at in person in Madrid a couple of weeks ago, and it's not in El Prado, it's owned by El Prado, but I can talk about this painting a lot, so I will just move on. But think of Blackness and the contrasting element in terms of color in relation to representation, and how the formation of race phenotypically becomes I guess concentrated into the representation of color. So some like takeaways to an extent, but I would just focus on one because I want to quickly mention something else. So the discourse of race is first created aesthetically. And of course, race and racism are routinely viewed in rational terms, originating from social Darwinism, which views Western white civilizations as superior. It does not address, this conceptualization does not address the affective, volitional, emotional aspect of racism. This aspect induces hatred, terror, messianism, tokenism, fetishism, and other emotions toward Black and racialized people in general, that mobilizes sometimes implicitly exclusion that creates inequality. This affective or emotional component of the assemblage of race comes from a pre-Enlightenment first aesthetic assemblage of races as markers for colonial endeavors. And we must remember that art is indissolubly, and visual culture indissolubly associated with emotions. It's intuitively, as our last speaker mentioned to us. Quickly, there is obviously a massive complicity between aesthetics and the aesthetic conceptualization, the first aesthetic conceptualization of race and racism, and how it still operates today. Thus, it is important to look at an aesthetics that could be not only colonial, but also decolonial. And this is something that my students really like in terms of like creating the not only possibilities of other types of views and visions through art, but also making it so it's what is it like? It changes and critiques the discourse. So a few artists here: Sexy and Dangerous by Brooke Andrews, Tracy Moffat, Patrick McGrath, who's Puerto Rican, looking at Cara Romero, First Nations, TV Indians, Laura Aguilar again, Self-Portrait 2, and Laura Aguilar, Three Eagles Flying. Yeah, so the takeaway is that there is a complicity between aesthetic discourse, but an aesthetics that is focused categorically on ugliness, categorically on monstrosity, and looking at the aesthetic effects on the emotional creation of what race and racism induces. Thank you.